Hello, my name's Robert. I'm carrying on from last week's video about Matthew's story of Jesus' birth to Luke's story. Luke introduces his gospel and gives us an immediate date marker in chapter 1 verse 5, in the days of King Herod of Judea. This is the same guy that Matthew also talks about in his chapter 2, King Herod, who, according to Matthew, was succeeded by a guy called Archelaus. That tells us exactly who we're talking about. There are 4 generations of the Herod dynasty in the New Testament, and the authors don't clearly distinguish them. They just seem to assume that their audience knows who they're talking about, which modern audiences, of course, don't. This is the founder of the dynasty, Herod I, a warlord basically, from Idumea, south of Judea. A man who wouldn't have been regarded as a proper Jew. These people had been forcibly converted in his grandfather's time. They were always very lukewarm about their Judaism, and they weren't really accepted. He was put in power by the Romans, basically as a border buffer between them and the Parthians, who ruled Persia to the east. And he was a very successful, very powerful ruler who had an enormous kingdom, supported to the hilt by Rome, of course. He died in 4 BC, and his kingdom was divided between his sons. There were 2 of them that matter as far as the New Testament was concerned. Archelaus, who was given the title of ethnarch, ruler of the people, and given Judea and Samaria. That's the historical Judea and Samaria, not the West Bank. And Antipas, who figures considerably in the Gospels, was given Galilee and Perea, an area on the East Bank, and the title of Tetrarch, ruler of a quarter, meaning a minor native prince. Luke, having mentioned King Herod, then goes on a lengthy excursus about the birth of John the Baptist to an elderly barren couple, a miraculous birth in line with the Old Testament accounts of people like Sarah and Hannah. In Luke's Gospel, he is treated as being a relative, a cousin of Jesus. So Elizabeth, his mother, gets pregnant, and then the angel appears to Mary. "I'm a virgin," she says. "I haven't done anything." Well, I'm sure she hadn't. Tradition seems to have remembered her as a very young woman. And, of course, as I said before, the Jewish accounts of miraculous births all relate to elderly or barren women. So Matthew and Luke both tweak the story in the same way, or similar ways, and have a miraculous birth to a very young woman. In Matthew's account, of course, she's betrothed to Joseph, who's horrified when she gets pregnant. "It's not mine. He's going to get rid of her." And then the angel appears and reassures him. In Luke's account, he never questions his paternity. There's only one place in Luke which might question it, in his genealogy, where he's said to have been Joseph's son, as was supposed. But apparently the Greek doesn't necessarily imply that he wasn't. So Luke just accepts effectively that Joseph is the father. The angel makes this announcement that she's going to get pregnant. Her son is going to be a king of David's line, essentially. The idea of Jesus as king is very much present in Luke's Gospel. And this birth is surrounded by wonders, as the births of major figures in the Greco-Roman tradition, mainly in the Greek tradition, apparently were. So Augustus, for instance, who lived at a moment when the Romans were absorbing this stuff from the Greeks, he was supposed, according to a writer called Suetonius, to be the son of Apollo, without denying his human parentage, which Suetonius makes a great play of. And when he died, Suetonius also recounts a report that he was seen ascending into heaven, just as Jesus is born Son of God and ascends to heaven at the end of the Gospel. Matthew, of course, was writing for a Jewish audience. We can see that from his interest in the Jewish law and his insistence, every bit of it, every least bit, had to be obeyed even more strictly than the Pharisees and Sadducees. Nobody ever said that Gentiles should have to obey Jewish law. This was something strictly for Jews. There's none of that in Luke. Luke appears to be writing for Gentiles. It's even been accepted he may have been a Gentile himself. And the whole atmosphere, though still miraculous, is distinctly different. Then John the Baptist is born. His father prophesies about Jesus coming. And then at the beginning of chapter 2 we have the actual birth of Jesus. In those days a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration, and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them at the inn. In that region there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Don't be afraid, for see, I'm bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Saviour, who is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign for you. You'll find a child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on the earth peace among those whom he favours." When the angel had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's now go to Bethlehem and see this thing that's taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. As I say, surrounded by wonders. And we get another date marker. And at this point we discover that somewhere along the line Luke has skipped a decade or so. Herod, as I said, died in 4 BC. Quirinius carried out his census in 6 AD, 10 years later. After Herod's death, as I said, Archelaus succeeded him in Judea and Samaria. But he was a very bad ruler, it seems, and after multiple complaints from the Jews, the Romans finally lost patience, sent him into exile, annexed the region. They left his brother Antipas in place in Galilee, but they annexed Judea and Samaria, imposed direct rule, and the first thing they did, of course, was to carry out a census to determine the tax base. So they sent Quirinius, the governor of Syria, the man with the ultimate responsibility for defence along an enormous part of the eastern frontier, from the Black Sea down to the border of Egypt, to establish the new province, or perhaps I should say sub-province, since the governor of Judea didn't have military responsibility. He was responsible for tax collection and policing, but if in the event of serious trouble he had to send for the Syrian governor with his legions. He was sent to establish that, and he carried out in the process a census. Every man had to go to his own town or his own city, depending on the translation. But you see, Galilee, as I say, was ruled by Antipas, who obviously had his own arrangements with the Romans. Judea was under direct rule. That's the first problem with this story. Joseph apparently had to go from one jurisdiction where he would already have been paying tax to another jurisdiction in order to register to pay tax there. That would be like me going to Paris from Birmingham to register to pay French income tax. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The only possibility might be that if he had property in Bethlehem and he just nipped down to register that. But there's no indication in the text that he owned anything there. If he did, you'd have thought he'd have found a place to stay. And in any case, what's he taking his very pregnant wife for? This is where Luke's story doesn't make as much sense as Matthew's. Matthew's hangs together in a very Jewish context, written, obviously, for a Jewish audience. I'm not saying it's necessarily historical. I question whether it is. But it's a good story, and it's true to the historical background. Luke's looks a bit more contrived. And, of course, later on in the chapter, he completely undermines the idea that Bethlehem is somehow Joseph's native town by saying that Nazareth is his town or city, polis in the Greek. It seems that both authors had to deal with three things established in the tradition. Mary was very young, that Jesus was from Nazareth, and that the Messiah, based on a passage in Micah, had to be born in Bethlehem. And Matthew, I think, copes with it rather better than Luke. So, the couple are in Bethlehem, and Mary comes into labour. There's nowhere for them to stay, no room at the inn, or so the translations would have us believe. That's not what Luke said, though. He describes the place as a kataluma, the same word he uses later on of the upper room in which the Last Supper took place, and nobody, to my knowledge, has ever called that an inn. What he means is a spare room. I've looked back at early English translations. Wycliffe doesn't call it an inn. It's just space in his version. Tyndale, who produced the first printed English New Testament, calls it an inn. Why, I have no idea, since he was translating from the Greek, not the Latin. But since then, and translations are very traditional, it seems to have got baked into the tradition in a way which isn't really helpful when you look closely. What's an inn doing in a out of the way little village like Nazareth? So they go there. Nobody's got a space where Mary can give birth. They end up in somewhere with a manger. It does not say that it's a stable, neither does it call it a cave. In fact, we have no description of the place at all. Most likely, what Luke was thinking of was a poor man's shack, a one-room dwelling place which happened to be empty. And these things were regularly shared with animals, which would have given the animals shelter at night and kept the place warm for the humans. It's the same arrangement that was used in British medieval peasant homes, and I think in quite upmarket homes as well. I once visited a reconstructed medieval house in North Wales, house of somebody who was quite wealthy, and it was just a great barn with a balcony for the family to live in, and the floor was given over to the animals. This would have been much more humble. And of course the mangers, which were necessary to provide the animals with food, were often built out of the same stone as the walls, so they're conveniently still there for the archaeologists to find today. So the baby's lying in the manger, Mary having just given birth. Wherever they're staying, it presumably gave her a bit of privacy for that. And angels appear to the shepherds. The angel of the Lord, surrounded by the glory of the Lord, implying the personal presence of God himself. And a chorus of angels, it seems. And of course the shepherds rush off and find the baby in the manger. All this is entirely in line with Luke's concern for the poor. His gospel, more than others, shows us concern for the poor, and the corollary of that, contempt for rich people who won't give their money away. I may deal with that later. So Jesus is born under very poor circumstances, is attended not by magi but by shepherds, men of a very humble occupation, not outcasts, I should say. I don't think there's any evidence of that. It's sometimes said that they'd have come into contact with dead bodies, so they'd just have been unclean. That's not true. Of course they came into contact with dead sheep periodically. I don't know how often. It can't have been a daily occurrence, or their flocks wouldn't have lasted very long. And when they did, it would have made them unclean. That much is true. But all they had to do was wait till sunset, take a ritual bath, and they'd have been clean again. So no, there's no reason to suppose they were outcasts. Uncleanness, ritual uncleanness, was something which must have happened to Jews quite regularly, and they had their ways of dealing with it. But they're poor men, and this is Luke's emphasis. So I'll wrap up there, and next time I'll look at the story of the Magi. Thanks for watching.